During the Second World War, there were many women who sided with the German enemy. They did this to possibly make their lives easier, but they may have also been pro-Nazi. Because of this, some women even became hunters, searching for persecuted people to then inform the Gestapo on. This would in some cases lead to deportations of innocent people to concentration camps, where they would be driven into the gas chambers. But at the end of the conflict, there were a number of women who were brought to trial for being a traitor, and they were then judged for treason. These female collaborators were then sentenced to death, and some were executed, being shot or hanged in front of large crowds. In this documentary, we look at 5 female collaborators who were executed. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe.
Violette Morris was born in April 1893, and she was a daughter of a retired French Army cavalry captain. During her teenage years she spent a lot of time inside of a convent, and she would then in August 1914 marry Edouard Joseph Goddard, but the couple would divorce 9 years later. But as the First World War was gripping the continent, Violette Morris decided to have an involvement in the conflict, and she would learn how to drive at this time, and she would then during the war drive ambulances at some of the deadliest battlefields. She would during the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun serve as a courier of information near to the front lines, and she was considered rather skilled at this. But Morris was a keen sportswoman, and she would play football for the French women's national team, and she won gold medals at the Women's Olympiads. But as well as being a skilled footballer, she was also a national water polo player, and she was also a pioneering boxer, and she would fight against many men and often at times beat them. Also she was involved in wrestling, weightlifting, diving, archery, motorcycle and bike racing, and even underwent surgery to allow her to fit in race cars more easily. She would compete in the Tour de France automobile and in many other races including endurance ones, but her lifestyle was very different to traditional women at the time. She dressed in men's clothes, swore often, was a very heavy drinker, and because of this the French Women's Sports Federation would refuse to renew her licence, and she would be barred from taking part in the 1928 Summer Olympics. She had also at some point punched a referee during a football match, but her racing licence would also be revoked, and she would then try to sue these authorities and bodies. At her trial she stated that, "We live in a country made rotten by money and scandal, ruled by speechifiers, schemers and cowards. This country of little people is not worthy of its elders, not worthy of survival. Some day its decay will bring it to the level of a slave, but if I'm still here, I won't be one of those slaves. Believe me, it's not my temperament." However, in January 1933, Violette Morris moved to a houseboat with her partner Yvonne Debray, and they were then moored on the River Seine in northwest Paris. They lived off the inheritance that they received, and also sung and began to gain popularity, as they would perform sometimes on the radio. But on Christmas Eve 1937, whilst they were having dinner with their neighbours at a restaurant in Neuilly, Violette came across an aggressive drunk man named Joseph Lecam. She tried to calm the man, but the man then the next day arrived at their houseboat, and an argument broke out between Lecam and Violette Morris. He pulled a knife and threatened her, but Morris pushed him, and then he lunged at her with the knife, and she then pulled out a revolver and shot Lecam twice. He later died in hospital, and because of this Violette was then charged with murder and was held in prison before her trial, but she was acquitted on the basis of self-defence. But then something surprising would occur. Her reputation as an iconic female sportswoman would be overshadowed, and she would become involved and ingratiated with one of the most evil regimes the world has ever seen. In December 1935 she met Gertrude Hanecker, who was an ex-racer but also a German journalist. She was a recruiting officer and agent for the SD, the Nazi security service, and she invited Violette Morris to attend the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, and she would then become an esteemed guest of Adolf Hitler. But this then began a number of years in which Violette would collaborate and willingly pass over information about the French military that she could get her hands on. Some information that she passed on to the Nazis was invaluable, including partial plans for the Maginot Line, which were passed to the German army, as well as maps of strategic points inside of the city of Paris. She even gave over diagrams and schematic blueprints for the French tank the Saumur S-35. The information regarding the plans of the French defences would be invaluable during the German invasion of France during the Second World War, but it's not known what led to this seemingly iconic French woman to become in the pockets of the Nazis. As the Second World War broke out, she would continue to collaborate with the Nazis and would continue to betray her nation. She became a member of the Karlingi for collecting the money that the French had to pay to the Germans to buy goods to France on behalf of the German state. But what this was a French division of the Gestapo, who could at times arrest and torture people, and they were supported by the Vichy government. Propped up by the Nazis, Violette Morris lived very well on her barge, and she would then during the occupation of France take on a number of different roles for the Nazis and the Germans. One of her objectives was to help foil members of the Special Operations Executive, a British spy organisation that would help collaborate and link up with the French resistance. It's believed that Violette, during this, would have been involved in the torture of the suspects, and many of these were women. She would have conducted barbaric torture interventions, where she would beat and whip the prisoners, as well as batter them senseless, and she became, allegedly, a complete brute. Violette Morris was also involved in sourcing black market petrol and gas for the Nazis, and she would run a garage for the German Air Force, also to conduct maintenance and fill up their aircraft. She also drove key Nazi and French officials, and she would have done this in the lead up to the fall of France also. Some historians have debated her role in the spying and torturing, and others class her as a scapegoat, but her reputation became rather well known across Paris and France, and she was referred to as a notorious hyena of the Gestapo. The work that Violette was conducting was directly contributing to the arrests and suffering of many French civilians, and she continued to work for the Germans and the Nazis, and continued to be a rather active collaborator. But because of her reputation, she then became a target for the French resistance, who once they were gaining a foothold across the nation, began to attack. The resistance at times wasn't the best coordinated, but they would try to take out those who were considered helpers for the Nazi regime. After years of occupation, and after years of suffering, they decided to take out Violette Morris. On the 26th of April 1944, she was driving her Citroën Traction Avant along a country road from Leuilly to Epagens in Normandy. Inside the car were members of the Balieu family, who had also benefited from the Nazi regime. However, she didn't realise that the car she was driving had in fact been messed around with by members of the French resistance, who had planned to ambush her. As Violette Morris's car came to a spluttering halt on a country road, members of the French resistance stepped out from hiding places, and they opened up their machine guns and weapons onto the car. The vehicle was littered in bullets, and inside the car 3 adults and 2 children were all killed. There were accusations that Morris was the intended target, but inside the vehicle the resistance had taken out a number of collaborators, but also, tragically, some children. Violette Morris's body was literally riddled with bullets, and was then taken from the car to a local morgue. Her body went unclaimed, and she was then buried inside of an unmarked grave. Many historians have debated her involvement inside of Nazi-occupied France, and some have doubted the scale of her collaboration. It's believed that she did, a few months before her death, tell the Gestapo about a resistance network involved in parachuting people into the country, and they would also sabotage machinery. The Gestapo would then shoot these 6 people, including the wife of one of the resistors. Another informing session led to the Germans capturing an arms store which was being built up, with 7 resistance members then being killed, and 10 more were sent to the prisons of Paris for torture. But others have claimed the resistance made her a scapegoat. But Violette Morris's career as a celebrated and skilled athlete of the 1920s was overshadowed by her involvement with the Nazi regime, which brought a significant amount of shame to her legacy. But she would meet a brutal and bloody end alongside others who were suspected of collaborating with the Nazis, with her body and car riddled in bullets. What is interesting though is why Hitler invited her specifically to attend the Olympics. He may have seen Violette as someone who could be used to gain information, which is what she did. She was a woman who had a sketchy past involving murder, but she was someone who suffered financially during the 1930s. The schmoozing by the Nazis for her may have been what ingratiated her into helping them during the Second World War, but information she passed over would be key for the invasion of France.
Anna Ans van Dijk was born on the 24th of December 1906. She was the daughter of Jewish parents, Ans van Dijk and Katje Bin. It's assumed that she had a relatively normal upbringing, and in 1927, at the age of 21, she married Bram Querido. However, within 8 years they'd separated, and following this she had a relationship with another woman, and then opened up a shop in Amsterdam. Her shop was for headwear or hats, however dark times for the Netherlands were on the horizon. On the 10th of May 1940, the Germans invaded the neutral Netherlands, and within 5 days of the army rolling into the country, the armed forces had surrendered. Rotterdam had been heavily bombed during the attack, and the royal family quickly left the country, fleeing to London. The invaders placed the country under immediate German occupation, and the swift invasion shocked many, especially because of the neutrality of the Netherlands. The armed forces defending the Netherlands quickly folded, as they had old weapons and equipment and poor numbers of these, and they were caught out by shock. Their weapon systems in place were from the First World War and had not been updated. They had a very small amount of armoured cars and tankettes and could not compete with the rapid assaults of the Wehrmacht. Rotterdam was blitzed by Luftwaffe bombers, and around 25,000 homes were destroyed, with hundreds killed. The locals pressurised the garrison commander of the city to surrender. The Dutch High Command was shocked by the large-scale bombing, and they ordered the army to surrender. Life inside of the occupied Netherlands got tougher as the war went on, with large-scale food shortages. Hitler thought highly of the Dutch people, and he considered them fellow Aryans. There were attempts to appease the population and to sway them to the National Socialist ideology, and the leaders of the Netherlands eased on the repression of the civil population. However, for Jews, they were persecuted heavily inside of the country. The Nazis began early to deport Jews to different concentration camps, and the Dutch people saw this and began to strike. Mass deportations continued, with Jews being sent to transit camps, before being sent to concentration camps further away. Jews were forced to wear the Star of David, and the survival rates of the Dutch Jews was around 27%. Now, as mentioned, there was a significant degree of collaboration with the Nazis. Between 20,000 and 25,000 Dutch men, for example, joined the Heer, or the Waffen-SS, with whole brigades of Dutch soldiers fighting for the Nazi cause. Some even saw action on the Eastern Front, and even fought in the Netherlands themselves. But there were very shameful parts of collaboration. Women who collaborated or slept with German soldiers were often forced into ordeals of public humiliation, having their heads shaved and being painted with swastikas. Ans van Dijk was one collaborator who sold her soul to the Nazis. Her hat business and shop was closed down by the Nazis in 1941, as they sought to seize all Jewish property in Amsterdam, and Jews were forbidden across the country to own businesses and to work inside of retail shops. There were other restrictions on them. Because of the closure, Van Dijk was left out of work, but being Jewish herself, she must have feared for her life at some point. It's alleged that to make money she began to sell goods where she could, and she also allegedly helped Jews to find hiding places. However, in January 1943, she was forced to hide from the Nazis to escape deportation. On Easter Sunday 1943, she was arrested by the SD and Detective Peter Schaap of the Office of Jewish Affairs of the Amsterdam Police after she was caught. During her interrogation and interview, to avoid deportation and to secure her freedom, Van Dijk decided to switch over and to collaborate. She agreed to help the SD to find Jews hiding in different places, and she agreed to work for them as a Jew hunter for her own safety. She began to infiltrate different circles, and she would offer help to Jews inside of Amsterdam, lying to them that she could help them to secure safe hiding places, and also provide them with false papers. She did this a number of times, and she managed to trap at least 145 people, and it's estimated that this number was even higher. In a horrific show of how sick she really was, she even managed to lure her own brother and other family members, and then they were turned over to the Nazis. Of those at least 145, it's estimated that at least 85 of the people snared by Ans van Dijk were murdered inside of concentration camps. However, other estimates have put her betrayal even higher, saying that she was responsible for turning over around 700 Jews to the Nazis. There have even been suggestions that Ans van Dijk may have been the one who found out about Anne Frank's secret annex, and that it was her who provided the information for the Gestapo to raid the annex and for the Frank family and the other hiders to be seized. She could have been the one behind the death of Anne Frank. She continued to turn over Jews to the Germans, but after the Second World War she was arrested. She had moved from Amsterdam to The Hague and was arrested at her friend's house on the 20th of June 1945. She was interrogated by Dutch police and was charged with 23 counts of treason against the people of her nation. Ans was brought to trial on the 24th of February 1947 and was brought in front of a judge and a courtroom. During her trial, she claimed that she had acted and agreed to only help the Germans to save her own life, stating that if she did not agree to help the SD and the Nazis, then she would have been sent to a concentration camp and would have been killed. She said this was the only reason why she did it, denying she was a Nazi, but amazingly she confessed to all 23 counts of treason. It was obvious what Ans van Dijk's sentence would be, as she was key to the murder of those men, women and children she handed over. Without her, they would not have been killed. Ans van Dijk for her actions was sentenced to death. She tried to appeal her conviction, pleading that without her turning over Jews, then she would have been killed herself. However, this went to the Special Court of Appeals. She even requested to the Queen Wilhelmina for a royal pardon, but this was again rejected, confirming her death sentence. On the 14th of January 1948, Ans van Dijk was brought from her prison to Fort Bema, and the night before her execution, she was baptised and joined the Roman Catholic Church. She also wrote a number of goodbye letters, including one to a nun who visited her in jail. However, early in the morning she was brought out to what looks like a moat of the fort or a ditch surrounding a wall. Next to the wall were sandbags to ensure that bullets did not ricochet, and as she was brought into the ditch, she was led out to a post. She was then tied to the stake, and her hands and legs were also secured to ensure that Van Dijk could not escape. Over her head, a black cap was placed to ensure that she could not see her final moments. Opposite her was a firing squad who were then given a signal to get ready. The firing squad then, once the signal was given to fire, fired straight into Ans van Dijk. Her execution was one which can be viewed as slightly controversial, as she was Jewish herself, and it's clear that but for her collaboration, chances are that she would have been killed inside a concentration camp. However, what she didn't have to do was to take her role as a snitch for the SD to the level that she did, as for her actions, dozens were sent to their deaths inside some of the worst and most evil places the world has ever seen. Antonina Makarova was born in a small village in 1920. Little is known about her early life. However, she was allegedly so shy that she forgot her last name whilst at school. She studied later in Moscow, but when the Second World War broke out, she ended up joining the Red Army. Women were allowed to serve within the Red Army. Initially they were turned away, but some even became soldiers after Stalin changed his rules to make up for the huge initial losses caused by Operation Barbarossa. Makarova became a volunteer nurse and tended to the injuries of wounded soldiers brought from the battlefield. Whilst being a nurse, she also took courses in how to handle weapons, including a machine gun, which she would later use to devastating effect. She did not remain as a nurse for long, as in autumn 1941, around 600,000 Soviet soldiers were surrounded by the Germans, and Antonina was part of this. She managed to escape the enemy by wandering for months through the forest and villages, and she would shelter with locals for a short amount of time, before then again moving on. In the summer of 1942, she came across the village of Lokot, which was under German occupation. The region she was inside of was different to others living under the Nazis. It was being used as an experiment, and a local governance had been set up by Konstantin Voskoboynik, who was then later replaced by Bronislav Kaminsky. The area was established to maintain order, and the region was allowed to create defensive units, which later became the Russian National Liberation Army. This was ultimately a group of Soviets who fought under Nazi command. The units became known for brutality and would later barbarically put down the Warsaw Uprising, massacring large amounts of the population. These soldiers in particular, who belonged to the RONA, were deemed traitors, and many were happy to conduct Nazi atrocities. Antonina had to make a decision. She could either try to link up with the partisans who were nearby in the forest. However, she saw that the Soviet collaborators were living in luxury compared to these. She then integrated herself with the group in the Germans and slept with German soldiers and attended many parties. Within a short amount of time, she then became involved in military matters. She was hired by the Germans to become a machine gunner, and it was in this role that she became a feared and brutal executioner. She was given the job to execute Russian prisoners of war and partisans, and also their families, including wives and children. This was a bloody job, but she seemed okay to carry this out. She was ordered to execute groups of 27, the number which a local prison could hold. The executions would take place near to a former stud farm, and Makarova lived in the same building. Often the locals would describe how the gates of the prison were opened, and a group of prisoners were then led out of the prison, followed by a cart which held a machine gun, with a young woman, Makarova, sat behind on it. She would then open up the machine gun on the prisoners, executing them in cold-blooded fashion. She later told investigators, "I didn't know these people I shot, and they didn't know me, so I felt no shame for them. For me, all those sentenced to death were the same, only their number changed. The arrested were lined up in a pit. One of the men rolled my machine gun to the execution site. At the command of my superiors, I knelt down and fired until everyone fell dead." It was later said that German and Hungarian generals would come to watch the spectacle, with the female executioner slaying her fellow citizens with the machine gun. She never missed, but if there was a prisoner who wasn't killed by her bursts of fire, she would then go up behind them and finish them off with a pistol shot to the head. There was one occasion where a number of children survived, with the bullets flying above their heads. They played dead and were later saved by the locals, who were forced to bury the victims, and then they were passed over to the partisans, who promised to hunt down the female executioner who had massacred their parents. After an execution, Makarova took off the clothing of the dead and often stole their possessions. She became known as Tonya, the machine gun girl, for these shootings, using her Maxim machine gun for the job. She believed these executions were necessary and a normal part of warfare, and sometimes 3 group executions were carried out a day. It's believed that she shot dead 1,500 people during her time spent executing for the Germans. For carrying it out, she was given 30 Reichsmarks, and her notorious reputation came before her. In the summer of 1943, she was sent to a German hospital for treatment for syphilis, and this saved her from being captured by the Red Army, who later liberated Lokot. They found the graves of those 1,500 executed by Makarova, and with this the hunt was on for the shooter or the shooters. She claimed she was a Soviet nurse and stole a military ticket from a murdered prisoner, and she managed to escape justice working as a nurse in a hospital. She later met her husband, taking his surname, and the couple settled in Lapel and had 2 daughters. Post-World War II, she worked at a clothing factory, but eventually she would be caught. The Soviet military police and the KGB had been looking for Tonya the machine gun girl since 1943, and they had very few witnesses and pieces of information about her. No one knew her name, and the search continued for a long time. In 1973, the KGB interrogated another collaborator who said he knew about the machine gunner. One of Antonina's brothers even told the KGB how his sister was Antonina Makarova and was now living as Antonina Ginsburg. A secret KGB operation was planned, and several witnesses confirmed her as the executioner. She was then arrested and taken to Bryansk, where she was placed in prison. Whilst here, she was noted to have behaved rather calmly, answering all of the questions clearly. During questioning, she did not talk about her family and did not even want to speak with them. Her husband was told of her true identity, and he then took his daughters and left. She believed that as decades had passed since her murderous actions, that she would simply be pardoned or given a few years in prison and then released. But this is not what happened. The court decided that she too should face up to the crimes that she committed, with the ultimate sentence. She was sentenced to death, and despite it not being possible to highlight the fact she executed 1,500 people, it was confirmed that she was responsible for at least 168 of those. At 6 a.m. on the 11th of August 1979, Antonina Makarova was brought into an execution courtyard. Facing her was a firing squad. She was tied to a stake, and then the men readied their weapons and shot straight into the infamous female Nazi executioner. She was 59 years old when she was executed, and it closed a chapter on one of the biggest KGB manhunts ever ordered. Her execution for some was penance for the cruelty she inflicted, but her own daughter released a statement on the woman she only knew as her mother, and not the executioner. She said, "Pain, pain, pain. She spoiled the life of 4 generations. You would like to know whether I would take her back if she returned? I would. She's my mother after all. I really don't know how to remember her, as if she is alive or dead. According to the law, women were not shot. Maybe she's alive somewhere. And if not, tell me. I'll finally light a candle for her soul." It appears with this that she was slightly in denial at the fate her mother met, with her being executed by the firing squad. She was one of only 3 women executed by the Soviet Union following the death of Stalin. So Antonina Makarova, or Tonya the Machine Gun Girl, was an executioner who, despite being raised in the Soviet Union and working for the Red Army as a nurse, defected over to the enemy. With the defection and job she was given to become an executioner, it attracted a lot of interest, where her shooting of prisoners of war would be met with watchful eyes from generals. Seeing the female Soviet mowing down the people with her machine gun attracted a great degree of intrigue by those around her. She ultimately met her own justice, being executed over 30 years after the Second World War came to an end. After the end of the war, inside of Hungary, there were many executions that took place outside the Academy of Music in Budapest. This building became synonymous with the executions of former politicians who had plunged the country into a tragic and terrible war that saw the land closely allied with the Nazis. Hungarians would fight alongside German soldiers, and they would be rocked by huge deportations of people from their lands to concentration camps. The truth was that there were many politicians who became Prime Minister quickly and came within power, and they collaborated with the Nazis and with Hitler and Mussolini, and after the war, a number of these politicians, including Bela Rady, were executed in Budapest, outside the Academy of Music. Thousands would flock to witness these executions, and to see what they believed justice being carried out. However, what is the story of the woman who was executed inside of Budapest, in the same place it's believed as the former Prime Ministers? Maria or Mansi Nagy was a World War II criminal who had been taken to a People's Tribunal or trial. These were held to deal with those who were accused of crimes against humanity and of causing huge suffering inside concentration camps. Those members of the army who committed atrocities were also tried in this way, and following her trial, Maria or Mansi was then condemned to death. But what did she do? It's believed that as she was a Second World War war criminal, she was known for torturing young Jewish women. This leads to the possibility that she was actually a woman who worked inside of the concentration camps. There were many women who became guards for the SS inside of camps within the Third Reich, such as Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, and a number of them were condemned for their crimes. But usually women like Irma Grazer were executed in private within prison cells and execution chambers, well away from the eyes of the public. The name associated with the condemned woman, Mansi, is short for Margaret in Hungary, and what is strange is that little documented evidence, except from pictures and photographs, remain regarding her fate and execution. She is considered an unknown war criminal, and from the images it's clear that she is a woman who was rather elderly. She looks rather respectable and is wrapped in a sweater, but looks petrified as she makes her way to her execution. But there is another possibility as to why she was executed. In the final days of the Second World War in Hungary, there was large-scale killing and looting as the Soviet Red Army invaded and took city after city before moving to Budapest. It's possible that Mansi was one of those who stole the property of displaced people, or that she attacked women who were already suffering. For her to be sentenced to death,
it's clear she must have done something that was very, very serious. She could also have been someone who was a collaborator with the Germans and who passed information on to the Nazis, the Gestapo or the SS about possibly the locations of Jewish women or prisoners. There were people who were paid to hunt Jews across Europe, and they acted off tip-offs from neighbours and local people to do this. Perhaps Mansi was one of those collaborators who were considered the lowest of the low inside of society. In Holland, there was one young woman who was executed for this crime, but she was deemed to have been a war criminal on the same level as the SS, who were deporting Jews to concentration camps. She was willingly giving over Jews to the enemy, and they would then be exterminated as soon as they arrived at sites such as Auschwitz. For Mansi Nagy to be executed in front of a crowd inside of Budapest, her offence and crime must have been incredibly serious and also shocking. The witnesses that day would have known that they were seeing the death of a war criminal. The events of her execution were in keeping with the executions of prominent Hungarians throughout the war. She was led out from her prison and was taken to an execution post and would be executed using the pole hanging method. With this, a noose was attached to a pole or a large wooden stake through a hook, which was then fed through an eyelet to the executioner, who was stood behind the condemned. When the wooden plank someone was standing on was removed, the executioner would pull on the noose and strangle the condemned against the pole. Death usually occurred in a few minutes. Maria or Mansi Nagy was accompanied by a priest who remained with her for her final moments, and the preparations for her execution were done by the executioner, who was wearing a suit and a hat, and also his assistant who helped him. These two, it's quite clear, were also the ones who performed the killing, and she would not be alone in her final moments. On the pole next to her was a white sheet in which a previously executed person was covered up in their final moments. This person would have been executed minutes before, and their body was then kept out of view of Mansi as she approached the stake. With her legs tied and her arms tied and the rope passed around her middle, she then climbed on top of the wooden box or step as the executioner fastened the noose and the rope around her neck. The step was then removed and she was left, and within minutes she was executed by the executioner. The story of Mansi or Maria Nagy is one which is shocking. What did this elderly woman do that was so offensive and evil that she would be taken in front of a crowd in Budapest and would be executed in public? Judging by the shape of the windows and the brickwork behind her, the execution must have occurred outside the Academy of Music, where former ministers and politicians were also executed. These sometimes were executed by a firing squad, however. Former Prime Minister Ferenc Selassie, who was one who was considered one of the country's worst war criminals, would be executed on the same stakes and in the same manner as this elderly woman. It's believed that she did and would have collaborated with the Nazis and Germans, and may have given up Jewish women who were hiding out, and they were then taken to extermination centres and were killed. But the sight of the elderly lady making her way to her death is one which has still puzzled historians, as we do not know too much about her crime. But the ageing lady in her sweater, in the eyes of the Hungarian officials and the witnesses and the people of Budapest, must at the time have deserved her execution for whatever she did.
Throughout World War II, Hitler ordered his army to rampage into different lands and territories, and these were then brought to heel in terrifying and brutal occupations, which resulted in much death and bloodshed. Czechoslovakia was occupied by the Germans, and Hitler in 1939 declared the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and this left the nation powerless to German occupation and governance, and the country was known as the Arsenal of the Reich, as it was intended to produce a huge amount of armaments, weapons and equipment for the Wehrmacht and overall German war effort. Ruthless Nazi overseers such as Reinhard Heydrich were brought in to oversee these nations, and he brought with him a reign of terror which was intended to keep the country productive and to keep the Czech people at heel. Terrifying persecution laws were brought in, and it was common to see people hanging in the streets to send a clear message to people to stay in submission and to not resist. Herta Kasparova was born on the 21st of June 1923 in the town of Trieste, and her father had a humble job working on the railways. However, Herta from birth suffered a disability, and she walked with a limp caused by her right leg, and because of this, while she was at school, she was bullied and treated terribly by other students. Her family spoke Czech and also German, and because of this, when Hitler seized control of the Sudetenland following the Munich conference, she and her family were seen as favourable by Hitler. He wanted German families to live inside of these lands, and Herta was given Reich citizenship because of her German origins and roots. She was of dual nationality and was also part of Hitler's Reich. She even changed her surname to Kaspar to make it sound more German too. But in 1940, she started a new job inside of an office of the German criminal police in a town named Jihava, and she served as an interpreter. As she could speak Czech and German, she was seen as useful by the Gestapo, and with this she was involved in interrogations of many Czech people who were suspected of being involved in the resistance, and because of this she was now openly collaborating with the Nazi enemy. The Gestapo were known for roughly treating those who were suspected of being in defiance to the Nazi regime, and many people were tortured to death or were executed for their involvement. Herta was now involved in the business of working for the Gestapo, and she was an important cog in securing the deaths of many Czech people. Many of those who worked with the Gestapo, the SS or the Nazis in any capacity were seen as the worst of the worst, and many were hunted at the end of the war to be executed for their collaboration with the enemy. She continued to translate for the Germans for a number of years, but at the end of the Second World War, as the Red Army were moving towards Herta's hometown, she quickly left her job and went back to living with her parents in Trieste. But after the Prague Uprising, there were many different pockets of resistance in Trieste, and they targeted those who had helped the Germans throughout the occupation. Different Wehrmacht units then arrived to free a number of imprisoned German people, and Herta Kasparova spoke to the German soldiers about the fact her house had been broken into. She even then identified a number of men and boys who had stolen items, and for this action she chose 11 people, and all of those 11 that Herta had chosen were then dragged out to the courtyard of the town hall in her hometown, and they were then executed by a firing squad alongside a number of other rebels. Amongst the executed were allegedly some of the people who bullied Herta Kasparova at school, and she got vengeance against them, utilising the German links that she had to have them shot. But the Germans also released her from her imprisonment at the hands of the rebels, and she then ran off to Austria and served in a number of jobs, including working as a cook. But part of her employment saw her working for the Red Army, her enemy. However, in February 1946, she was arrested and was then sent to Czechoslovakia to stand charges relating to being a collaborator with the Germans. She was placed on trial for the work she conducted alongside the Gestapo as an interpreter, and also as someone who was responsible for the executions of those who she had personally identified. At her trial, Herta stated that, "I know that I caused the death of several people. I acted out of revenge." She was vengeful, and she knew she would be condemned. The court confirmed her darkest fears and sentenced her to death for collaborating with the Nazis and for treason against the Czechs. Her execution, however, was one which was to be very different, and she was only one of a very few number of women who were executed by pole hanging at the end of the Second World War. Pole hanging as an execution method was common in Czechoslovakia and Hungary at the end of the war, and a number of high-ranking politicians and government officials were executed in this manner instead of using a gallows. Herta Kasparova was executed that evening after her death sentence had been given to her. She was walked outside to a meadow on the outskirts of Trieste, close to the castle. On the day before, the head of the Nazi offices inside of the town was executed in the very same way, and Herta was brought out in front of the huge crowd. The pole-hanging post was 3 meters tall and it was 60 centimeters wide. When she was led up to the post, she lost her calm composure, and Herta began to scream and shout for her life, and she even fell to the floor as her knees began to shake so much. She had to be carried to the execution post by the guards who were with her. Herta wore a short dress to her execution, and she continued to cry and scream as she was led up to the execution post. The executioners, seeing her panic, began to work quickly, but they also made sure that everything would be performed correctly and professionally. With pole hanging, it relied on a number of steps, and they fastened a leather strap around her chest, which held her in place and in position in the air on the post briefly. The executioner then secured the rope around her legs and passed it through a pulley system, as well as making sure that Herta Kasparova's arms were secured together to prevent a cleaner small drop. He then secured the noose around her neck and then checked his work before he signalled that he was ready. The hangman was stood on the step behind her post, and the sign was given to the assistant to release the drop, and he did so. The executioner guided Herta's neck with his hand and dislocated her neck, and with this she began to twitch and move side to side. But there was a problem as her head began to move significantly, and it took a number of minutes for her to be confirmed dead. A number of Czech doctors came over to her remains, and they checked for a heartbeat, but there was nothing. With this, Herta was then cut down, and she was placed inside of a cheap coffin that lay under the pole, and within the coffin some person had even placed a number of flowers within the wooden box for her. Her remains were carried into the central cemetery in Jihlava, and she was interred alongside a number of German soldiers who had died in the local area fighting during the war. And it's interesting that she was buried in this place, as they saw her as the enemy, even in her death. The execution of Herta Kasparova was a huge event for the people in the town of Trieste, and people even brought tickets to secure the best position to see her death. It was almost like a medieval carnival, and for those inside of the Czech town, she was seen as the enemy, and someone who carried out the evils of the German army, and helped the Nazis with their persecuting work. In the translation work she completed for the Gestapo, she was complicit in the torture of many people, and her work helped the Gestapo to execute many accused of resistance. She was executed herself for the collaboration, but also for the fact she actively chose 11 men to be executed, and many of those were those people who mocked her at school. She had vengeance for this taunting in the most barbaric way, and Herta Kasparova contributed to a number of war crimes also. But her execution was a huge spectacle, and it was one of the final public executions carried out inside of Czechoslovakia. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.